Like moths to a flame, you've thrown caution to the wind for a glimpse into our world. Well, now you're in it.
Welcome to Effed Up Stories.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Effed Up Stories. I am your host, Will Pender.
And I am your co-host, Ryan Sharp.
And tonight, with this episode, we begin with Near-Death Week. Think Shark Week, but this week for us is all about near-death experiences. We're going to have like 4 or 5 of these for you. It's going to be coming all week. And I'm really excited about it. It's one of the topics that I'm most interested in, perhaps because that's really the ultimate destiny as far as we can conceive in our human bodies. Where do we go from here? It's the scariest question. It's the most important question. So tonight we're going to begin with a user submission. He's anonymous, by the way. He doesn't want to be known. His story, and I guess for good reason, he's a former drug addict, and that's how his story came to be. Before we do jump into that, I would just like to shout out that if you have an effed up story of your own on the paranormal, or pictures or video, we ask that you submit that to us, which you can do at our official website, which is effedupstories.com. That's EFFEDUPSTORIES.com. We will get it on the website, and we will get it into a podcast. And yeah, so we will put you on our site. And with that said, we're going to jump into the story. Again, it comes from it's anonymous, but it's from a former addict's near-death experience. So, this particular addict used to be addicted to heroin, which, as you know, is a very heavy drug. And but the good news is he's been clean since October 2013. So, thumbs up to you. I think that's awesome. But again, we're going to jump back to a story. So, as he says, when he was a user, he was always paranoid about getting a bad batch of this stuff, that in particular that would be laced with a drug or a chemical called fentanyl. It was cheaper to get, this kind of, I guess the risk was greater when you get cheaper batches of the drug, right? And he said fentanyl is an opiate and it's incredibly strong. He said injecting the same amount of fentanyl as that of heroin will kill you. He said it killed many of the friends that he knew, and so he was very paranoid that he was going to be unfortunate enough to get one of these laced batches. So because of this, he used to keep a drug called Narcan around in case like a friend or himself would overdose. And what that is, an injection of Narcan is an opiate antagonist that would actually prevent someone from dying. And this is something that the hospitals actually use if you're overdosing on something like heroin. So his friend, and this is a fictitious name, but we'll call him Craig. He and Craig split a motel for the night, and the whole idea was to shoot up and nod out from the long death of being junkie bums, as the way he described it. He said that, not going into all the details of how this came to be, but, they got their fix and they nodded off. And, little did he know at the time that, of course, the drugs that they had shared was laced with this very drug that he was afraid of getting. So he says, it's up to us and you, the audience, at this point in time, to decide if this was a near-death experience or if it was the drugs. But in his mind, for all intents and purposes, he was dying. He said if he had not gotten a Narcan, he would not be alive. So he nods off and he says he could see his body. He was looking down on it. He saw his friend. He could see everything that was going on in the room. He could see the EMTs. He said it was clear. And then he said things began to become fuzzy. He started to feel like pins were pricking him all over his body. He could feel like he was falling, just falling. And he heard screaming, blood-curdling screaming. He saw distorted faces. He said they circled around him. They spoke to him. And he said it sounded like 1,000 people speaking at once. He said of the distorted faces that surrounded him, he counted 4. He said it seems like there were waves of bright light washing over him, pulsating. And soon this became this warm feeling. He said he felt warm but cold at the same time. But he said it wasn't in a physical way, and he just can't describe it. And that's very typical, actually, of people who have near-death experiences. They get to a point where they experience something that they just can't explain the sensation that they're having. They can't explain it in a human vocabulary that makes sense to us. And he said at the time, he's not going to lie. He said he was an atheist. And he said he thinks that what happened to him can probably be explained by science. But, he said, even if he is a skeptic, he said, he loves the sight, he loves this kind of stuff, and this is his near-death experience. This is what happened to him. And it was so profound to him that he turned his life around. He said he don't smoke anymore, he doesn't drink, he doesn't even drink caffeine anymore. But he does, however, ever since then, experience frequent sleep paralysis, and he can completely understand how people think that it can be caused by the supernatural. As the old hag or, other things that we've discussed in previous episodes, he said, like many others who have experienced it, it's frightening as hell. And he said he also gets the feeling that something is watching him when he's half asleep. And he will actually bolt up at the sensation of this and turn on the light. And he said, understanding what's happening helps to cope with it, but, he doesn't really, he doesn't fault those that find their answers in a non-scientific light as well. And I think, just to elaborate a little bit on that, where he said, he'll be half asleep and he feels like there's something watching him. A lot of people who have near-death experiences, after they've had one, they're more able to sense certain things like that. It's like some of them will frequently feel like they can sense other presences, or feeling like they've been feeling like they're watched, or they're more open or able to sense paranormal activity, perhaps communication from dead relatives on the other side. So I know it wasn't a really long story and stuff like that, but I found it interesting because it still points out several things that are common to many near-death experience stories. One being that you are an observer of yourself and everything that is going on in the room. He would have died if he didn't get his Narcan. So for all intents and purposes, yes, he was near death. he was able to, he was outside of his body. I mean, that's not a normal, having the spectator view outside of your body is not a normal symptom or experience with heroin or any drug. An outer body experience is not, a normal, side effect of these drugs. So and again, he was a junkie. He had done this several times before. This was a different experience. It was unique. It was one that, caused him to change his life around. So again, like, we have this very profound experience, and, again, he was an observer. He was able to see what was going on around him, and it was clear. It was in fact, many people who have near-death experiences state that when they are on the other side spectating, they note how clear things are. They can see way better than they can in their human bodies. And that's even people that have good vision, right? So it's, he hits a lot of these things. And, one of the scary things, though, I guess, is the disturbing sensation that he got, the falling feeling. That's another common thing that people get, the feeling of falling. And then, he heard screams and blood-curdling screams and seeing distorted faces, and the fact that they circled him and hearing all these disembodied voices, that's a scary thing. I think anybody who's experienced that would say it was a traumatizing experience, a negative near-death experience. And it's unfortunate that he had this, and you hear a lot of similar stories from people who have these experiences from drugs. And, I've heard lots of accounts, from former drug users, and or even people that aren't, and they see basically a section in the other life where people have, they still have these addictions. Even in the spiritual realm, they still have their addictions they had in the flesh, whether that was cigarettes, that was alcohol, drugs, and in the spirit realm is like they're still not past it. They're still like some, for example, I've heard explained that they were on Earth, and they would see these people hanging around at casinos, these spirits, and they'd be in vain grasping at other people's cigarettes and booze, just trying desperately. They get a puff of a cigarette or a swig of a beer, and they just can't, and they're hung up on it, and they're tormented by it, and they're not able to move on. And the other side of it is that, and again, this is just other people's accounts. I'm not saying that this is exactly what happens. This is just things that I've read. But the other thing is that, from other accounts, they say that these people aren't, it's not that they're being punished and they're put here, they're put there to go through this. It's that they themselves put themselves there. They carry their addictions and stuff with them to the other side, and they just stay with it. They can't get past it. I mean, it's all hung up on themselves. God's not keeping them there, or anything like that. They can't seem to work out their past life problems. They're free to go. I mean, eventually some people will work through it and move on, but some people don't. So and again, I can't say his name, it's anonymous, but I'm very glad to hear that he's worked out on himself and he's no longer a user. And it sounds like, even if he is an atheist, a good thing came from this. He cleaned up his life. He's on a good track. He's going in the right direction, and hopefully when that time does come again, as it will to us all, hopefully his experience will be better.
I think, one of the most fascinating aspects for myself when it comes to the near-death experience phenomenon is a lot of the time, not all the time, but a lot of the time, people who get close to that, close to that point of no return, and they actually are able to come back, because otherwise we wouldn't have the story. Um, we often hear about them having this sensitivity to things that they didn't have before the experience. Um, Sometimes people see angels. Sometimes people are able to see spirits, or even darker entities, as it were. Sometimes, but I've always found that probably one of the most interesting aspects for myself. It's like the process of you know almost ending up in the spirit world forever. Um, it forces something open in the mind, and I guess at this point it's worth wondering out loud about, is that when we're talking the mind, because use the word observer, right? He had this experience. He was floating above his body, above his friend. He could see the room very clearly, and we're assuming this is the spirit self, and that obviously his consciousness was still intact, even while being disengaged with the flesh and blood brain. So does this unlocking, does that happen in the actual consciousness? Is that an altering of the non-physical part of us that is the observer? When you close your eyes and you think, where am I? You don't point at your foot or your arm or your heart. You point like somewhere in the center of your head, right? And we just assume that because our brain is up there, that that's where the observer is. But in stories like this, it forces us to wonder, the observer, the consciousness, the spirit, the soul, whatever you want to call it. It's not necessarily stuck with the body. And in these stories, we oftentimes we hear about them moving about the room independently, and then like I said, when they come back, they have this extra sensory ability to excuse me, detect non-physical entities that may be lurking about, whether they be positive entities or negative entities, or even just neutral ones, somebody popping in for a look. And he said he often feels like there's somebody watching him when he's asleep. I mean, that could just be attributed to paranoia, from years of drug use, maybe even a case of PTSD, from such a traumatic experience. But I think I find it personally one of the most interesting aspects of the whole phenomenon, because it implies that there's some kind of maybe not physiological change, but definitely some sort of change to consciousness that allows us to, that process of almost crossing over starts unlocking little doors in the consciousness. And then when the person comes back, those doors don't necessarily all get barred up again.
Well, it seems like from everything that I've read, I mean, I've read tons of near-death experiences. It seems like the body itself is almost like a prison or an anchor to this material world, and through it, there's a lot of things filtered out. In the spiritual realm, in paranormal, again, why we can't see a lot of things. It's just a lot of things are filtered out. We're just meant to experience this world, and part of what's filtered out is apparently past lives you've had, past experiences, because apparently we've done this all before. There's a lot of people who have, gone on the other side, and they say, like, as they get to this, I guess, room or place where they're about to be judged, or where they're about to, wherever it is that they end up, they say it feels very familiar, like they've done this many times before. They've been through this process. They recognize places. They recognize the feeling. And it's almost like when you come to Earth, all of that goes away. And I mean, if you look at Greek mythology, they had this whole thing with Lethe River, and the idea being that, you drink from this river and now you have amnesia, and you don't remember, your past experiences, your past lives and stuff like that. And it emphasizes on that idea of like when we come here, it's like we're not supposed to know of our past experiences and our past biases and lessons we learned, because the whole point of this life, we have certain goals and objectives we're supposed to, reach while we're here, and we can't do that unless we have, we have to come fresh. We can't come with preconceived notions. We can't come with past experiences. We can't know. It has to be fresh. For example, to know what it is like to be a disabled person, so you can respect and perhaps empathize or sympathize with people like that. I mean, you probably have to live like that, but you have to come here and experience that, yourself, not as someone who's maybe had a life that was similar, or who had been around this a lot to understand. Like, you have to come and do it fresh, and only then can you get a true understanding of what that is. And I mean, from different accounts that I've read, I mean, people apparently pick the parents they're gonna have before they come here. They pick the hardships, certain trials, certain, they have a certain goal. But when you come here, you don't know any of that. Like, you gotta stumble through it blindly. And the whole point of free will, apparently, is like you get these certain points along your path, and you get to make a choice, right? And the way that you choose is going to determine how you follow that path and what conclusion you're going to reach. So you do get input. You do get to have your say. You do get to make your own waves. But apparently this is all preset. And I guess that's where they say fate, But, the outcome that we actually get probably depends on the decisions that we make while we're here. And I could counter that and say that, based on the location you're in and the experiences you have, your personality, you're probably going to make the same decisions every single time, just on the algorithm of who you are and the location and stuff like that. But I'm not going to get into that whole thing this time. So, yeah, I mean, it's an interesting aspect. Now, that being said, that's this guy's story. We got several others that we're going to be covering over the week. And one particular episode we're going to be covering that is not user submitted, but is going to really detail a lot of the near-death experience that has been studied by scientific organizations over the years. I mean, literally collecting thousands of these things and putting together databases of information that we just wouldn't have access to otherwise. So very interesting stuff there. I hope you tune in for that. And after this week of the Near Death Experience Week, we'll be doing our week on cryptozoology. And we got some doozies there too. Really fast. I mean, some of those stories almost sound Lovecraftian. So for you H.P. Lovecraft fans out there, definitely tune into that. And we got one story where I think that the experience involved Mothman. So that, again, really cool. And if you have an effed up story of your own, we ask that you submit that at our official website, which is effedupstories.com. That's EFFEDUPSTORIES.com. We'll get it on the website. We'll get it into a podcast. And yeah, just keep those submissions coming. We got tons of content for you guys. And we hope you enjoyed the episode, and we'll catch you next time.
Have a great night, everybody.
everybody, and welcome to a new episode of Effed Up Stories. I am your host, Will Pender.
And I am your co-host, Ryan Sharp.
And tonight, with this episode, we begin with Near Death Week. Think Shark Week, but this week for us is all about near-death experiences. We're going to have like 4 or 5 of these for you. It's going to be coming all week. And I'm really excited about it. It's one of the... Like moths to a flame, you've thrown caution to the wind for a glimpse into our world. Well, now you're in it.
Welcome to Effed Up Stories.
Topics that I'm most interested in, perhaps because that's really the ultimate destiny as far as we can conceive in our human bodies. Where do we go from here? It's the scariest question. It's the most important question. So tonight we're going to begin with a user submission. He's anonymous, by the way. He doesn't want to be